So according to Stack Overflow, only 1 in 5 professional developers are actually happy in their jobs, if you believe that sort of thing from Stack Overflow. A similar survey from Atlassian tells us that 97% of developers feel they're losing up to a full day each week in unnecessary meetings and workplace inefficiency, which hits a little closer to home. And the same survey also states that 56% of developers are convinced that their leaders aren't doing anything to resolve these issues. So as someone who spends a significant amount of time each day trying my best to avoid these issues and keeping my team as happy and productive as possible, the thought of more than half of all developers lacking effective leadership seemed to me as being worthy of discussion. So let's talk about leadership, but at the same time, let's try something a little different. I believe it's important to acknowledge that we all had to start somewhere. So I'm going to take you all on a 3-part journey, beginning with my own challenges as a developer, starting right here in Brisbane nearly 20 years ago. We'll explore my own failures as someone thrown into leadership far too early, the lessons I learned along the way, and how this experience combined with the people, the systems and process at the Code Co have shaped my views of what it means to be an effective leader today, even though I'm still very much a work in progress. So, embarrassingly for me, my career technically started prior to getting my first job, which I feel obligated to start with. This masterpiece was the first website I was ever paid to build. It was the Vatuantan Noosa RSL Club in 2002, and I was 16 years old. It was built with Macromedia Dreamweaver MX. I proudly used tables for layout, and to me it was the best thing ever created. Now, this was a time where you actually had to convince people that they needed a website full stop. Most of them were happy with an ad in the paper or something in the yellow pages. But being paid to do something I loved so early set me on the path that led me to where I am today. So, once I was done with school, studying and failing as a teenage freelancer, it was time to find my first real job. Now, even though Seek, and that is actually from Seek in 2007, had about 4 times the number of IT jobs that it has today, my lack of experience still made it a little bit tricky. Living on the Sunshine Coast was an additional struggle. Remote work really wasn't a thing yet. And at this point, it was a 5-hour return train ride into the city from where I was living in Koran. And I actually ended up doing this for about 8 months until I finally bit the bullet and moved into the city. Eventually, I got my first job as a web developer with Brisbane City Council, coincidentally right above the library where yesterday's contributor day was held. What I soon found out, though, was what they meant by web developer was that I'd be doing XML and XSLT data entry for the council intranet. If you think that sounds bad, I can assure you it was much, much, much worse. I kept myself sane by tinkering with Drupal, of all things, on my lunch break, till one day I got a tap on the shoulder. Now, it turned out that someone from the other side of the building, who just happened to be working on a Drupal migration for our Brisbane.com, saw what I was doing, and he asked me if I wanted to join the team. Basically, I just said, yes, get me the hell out of here. Should have asked more questions. I had assumed that I'd been brought on in some sort of junior or entry-level capacity. After all, the work I'd shown him at the time was pretty basic. It wasn't until I was given my contract and I saw senior middleware technician written on it that I realised I'm in a bit of trouble. I had no idea what middleware was, and let alone having a senior level of experience with anything, apart from maybe World of Warcraft. This led to the worst case of imposter syndrome I've ever personally experienced. Now, I haven't been in a government job since, for obvious reasons, but back then, it was a surprisingly competitive environment, with everyone largely out for themselves. Most senior engineers seem to hold on to their knowledge as a way to become indispensable or secure that next contract extension. Less senior staff were more helpful. However, the senior title that I'd been given made me too nervous to reach out for help. So this was it was a tough 6 months, getting PTSD just thinking about it. I was struggling to get my work done during the day and making up for it by learning and working overnight. Somehow at the end of it, I was offered a contract renewal. I couldn't bring myself to take it. So rather than bore you with a play-by-play of everything that followed, I've chosen the top 3 most memorable moments from this period to highlight as I continued to find my feet. Number 3 was applying for a contract advertised as a PHP developer role, passing an interview that involved PHP-related questions, and then being given an ASP project by my team lead on day 1, who gave me a little pat on the back and said you'd figure it out. But I did, and then I never used ASP again. Number 2 is catching the swine flu when it was going around. I think it was like 2009, which knocked me out for a good 2 weeks. The memorable part, however, was finding out I'd been fired when my fever broke because I'd hallucinated the conversation with my boss, telling him I was too sick to make it to work. And the number 1, by far, was finally landing my first full-time role with a great salary, nice management, a 5-minute walk away from my apartment, which was super important, building web-based financial software for the US in 2008. Didn't last long. But I did eventually successfully transition into full-time employment, having a whopping 3 years of experience at this point, and obviously thinking I knew everything. I took up an offer to become a technical director and get in the ground floor of a new agency in Brisbane. I was absolutely not mature or experienced enough to deal with what was coming. Exhibit A. So this photo was taken from the launch party of Limelight Digital, what would eventually become one of the largest independent digital agencies in Brisbane. I'm in the back with my hand on my face, and yes, those are Kath and Kim impersonators. So we started with a bang, the best of intentions. Through connections in film, TV and radio, and a lot of hard work, within 2 years we'd grown from a handful of people to over 50. We'd moved from a small office in New Farm into an entire floor of a building in Fortitude Valley. And coming into our 3rd year, we were creating interactive experiences for some of the most well-known brands and television series in the world. However, to support this wild growth, I was having to spend the vast majority of my time accompanying BDMs and salespeople around the country to close pitches. Back when that sort of thing was all done in person, which was far easier to do when you could answer all their technical questions right there on the spot. The priority was winning, not how we were going to execute on the work that we'd won. With success came a lot of celebration and a lot of recovery time. And I spent a little less each day on the tools, which is far too early in my career to do so. Being full service also required us to take on any opportunity we were given. Developers were constantly getting up to speed on new frameworks or platforms, couldn't spend more than a couple of months at a time honing their skills. As I spent more time away from the office and on the tools, there was a disconnect between what I was helping to sell and what we were able to execute successfully without burning everyone out. And while you can use success to inspire people, that inspiration is temporary. It comes in waves, and it's overshadowed by the reality of the day-to-day. But because I was no longer there every day, I didn't share that reality with anyone. Winning made me lazy. I felt that any lack of management or leadership on my behalf was made up by for the sheer amount of revenue I was bringing in, which was a very mature and short-sighted mentality to have. By this time, I developed an enormous ego. I was very opinionated. And while this is a good combination for sales, depending on who you're talking to, it was a terrible one for leadership. And I'd often shut down ideas purely based on my own personal opinion. Thankfully, in retrospect, an acquisition by AdCorp created an opening for me to eject myself from the company. I'd already mentally checked out by this point, so it wasn't a huge change. Partially due to some form of existential crisis I got when I realised I didn't like the person that I was becoming. So, no more suits, no more boardrooms. It was time to get back to what I loved doing and for some time to reflect. On to the second part. It's time to lick my wounds and focus on what came next. At this part, I knew I'd slipped technically. I was self-conscious about my abilities, especially in contrast to my roles and experience on paper. I had to swallow my ego, find companies I knew would push me to the next level, and try the best to learn everything I could as quickly as possible. But thankfully, the slow rise of remote work made that possible. I joined companies pushing the boundaries of their respective fields, each with very unique cultures. I worked under leaders that were incredibly talented, operating at light speed, solving any problem with ease. However, the discipline of engineering always seemed to be the focus, rather than leadership itself. The shift to SaaS opened the door to frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue, in addition to DevOps, advanced developer workflows, CI/CD processes, things that at the time weren't common in agency world. Probably still aren't for many. So I learned as much as I could and started developing my own new personal outlook on leadership and culture along the way. The shift, though, gave me the opportunity to leave behind all the legacy CMS frameworks I'd picked up through years of digital agency work. WordPress became my sole focus for anything content related. Laravel, which was starting to pick up steam by that point, for anything web application related. With a renewed focus on WordPress, I began to contribute where I could, beginning with Pod's framework in 2012 when it was still fighting the good fight against advanced custom fields, which lost. I was actually able to dig up the first commit I ever made to open source, which is on the screen right now, although it belongs to a Git account I no longer own. Not my finest work, but I was surprised to see much of it is still in pods today. Now, a takeaway from this period, perhaps aimed at someone a little earlier on in their career, is if you feel like you're stagnating, don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. It may involve checking your ego at the door, handing in your made-up black belt for a white one, just as I did, and joining a team of killers that'll push you to the next level. It's a valuable exercise for aspiring leaders. It allows you to experience different onboarding processes, different cultures, different leadership styles. And I've found that it allows me to build up a longer lasting compassion when I'm interacting with new hires in general. Ask a lot of questions if you do, regardless of how you think it might make you look. You won't regret it. So, after 5 years of renewed focus, clawing back my confidence and my capability, it was time to make the obvious transition to becoming the co-founder and CEO of a beef jerky company. If this talk was held anywhere else, I probably would have skipped this bit, but since it happened here in Brisbane, I thought I'd leave it in. Ironically enough, this 3-year experience or ordeal in a completely different industry did more for my experience as a leader than the decade leading up to it. Now, why would someone leave the comfort of remote work and spend up to 18 hours a day in a factory, you might ask? I didn't know what to do with my hands, is the simple answer. As someone who's spent a decade at that point working in a completely virtual environment, creating virtual products, I had a strong desire to build something or make something physical. The opportunity to do this arose with a work colleague after I'd brought some jerky I'd made at home into work. Ridiculous. However, now I realise I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into. So we found a location, technically two, in Bowen Hills, which I'm sure at least one person here today has seen as they've driven in or out of the city along Sandgate Road. The branding is still there today. Before I knew it, the lease was signed and I'd committed to what would be the hardest 3 years of my life. I was still working as a technical lead in my co-founder's company by night, spending all my days at the factory. From the very beginning, there was a sense of scale, a sense of excitement and possibility. Every day I was faced with a new challenge. I was ordering industrial machinery, logistics, international freight, outfitting the office and the factory, let alone health and safety regulations. And I had some big lessons to learn almost immediately. Now, being an effective leader meant stepping back, not trying to solve everything myself as I'd been used to doing, and focusing on getting the right people in the right places at the right time in a way that resolved the issue quickly and cost effectively. I needed to think 5 steps ahead at all times with multiple levels of contingency planning. I needed to be across everything. God help me if someone on the board found out about a problem before I did. But eventually, things started to take shape. Every day brought new challenges. I was failing constantly, but I was iterating and improving just as quickly. It was an exciting time from a personal point of view. My kids and family were in the office and factory constantly experiencing this with me. And now with a brand new factory and an office, it was time to find people to fill it. Now, hiring in an industry you are familiar with can be difficult at the best of times, let alone one you're not. So this was really the next challenge for us to tackle. And defining the mission statement was crucial, both for finding the right people and knowing why we existed to begin with. What's our difference? But that part ended up being quite simple: to create the healthiest, highest quality beef jerky in the world with no compromises. Everything we did as a company reflected this mission. Packaging, ingredients, our attitudes, our marketing, the lot. And I learnt that creating a culture as a leader can be as simple as just living the mission statement, inspiring your team to do the same and always putting them first. And for any cricket fans, that's Ian Healy at the bottom right, about 10 seconds before he found out how hot our habanero jerky was. But like all good things, this eventually did come to an end. And like many others, we were severely impacted by COVID, which drove up meat prices and caused shipping delays of weeks or even months. Because staples were flying off the shelves so quickly, all the warehouse space at supermarkets was being reserved and prioritised for the items that were leaving the shelves, pushing ours out. Within the space of what seemed like a couple of weeks, we'd lost 80% of our business. Just like that, it was over. However, by this point, I was a completely different person and ready for what would come next. So, the third and final part of my story. Let's fast forward to today and taking everything I learned from both a technical and a leadership perspective, as well as a business owner. And apart from a few stints along the way as a fractional CTO, I ended up in my role at the Code Company. For anyone not familiar with us, we're a primarily Brisbane-based enterprise WordPress development agency. We're a co-founder of the Scale Consortium, along with our friends at XWP, Human Made, Side and Crowd Favourite. We work primarily with high-traffic digital publishers and websites that support tens of millions of users a month. We have a full-time remote team of 25, augmenting with contractors when we need to. We have an incredibly high retention rate and an average tenure of around 5 years, although there are those with us for over a decade, like Jackson right there. And lastly, we use a business framework called EOS, which stands for the Entrepreneurial Operating System, that I'll lightly touch on as we explore what makes our approach slightly different. Now, these are our actual core values at the Code Company. And as part of implementing EOS principles, it's one of the first steps you'll take, and also one of the most important. Without alignment on core values, trying to lead a team of any significant size will just become an ordeal. And the reason I'm starting this part of the talk with our core values is because they play a fundamental role in the operation of our business at every level and help define our culture. Everyone at TCC knows what they are. They know what their original intent was when they were written. And I personally ask everyone for their own interpretation of the values so I can grow to better understand them as a leader. So let's dig in to these core values just a wee bit deeper. I'll give you some practical examples of why they're important. A good vibe workplace. Should come as no surprise that people who share values for the most part tend to get along. When people get along, they're more productive, they work better as a team, and they support each other organically. This frees up leaders' time to focus on the important things, rather than dealing with conflict resolution or fallouts from miscommunication. Now, one of the main causes of developer dissatisfaction is the reluctance to remove toxic employees from a workplace and allowing that to fester. So cementing this as a core value helps remind us that no matter how talented or experienced a person is, the overall well-being of the team is more important. The simplest solution is often the best. As an engineering team, we refer to this value multiple times a day, actively seeking it out in simple solutions wherever possible. There's an elegance in simplicity. It often requires a far deeper understanding of the problem and the technology being used to solve it. It also has some tangible benefits. Simpler solutions are more cost-effective. They're less prone to error. They're easier to test, and they're easier for other team members to pick up and understand. Part of being an effective leader or a senior engineer is also to help guide your team on their own journey, the bell curve, which you've probably seen so many memes of, on their pathway from simplicity to complexity and back to simplicity again. Straight talking. We're not in the business of putting a spin on anything at the Code Co. Nothing comes from it, as I'm sure Theoden will attest to. We operate transparently. Some might argue a little bit too transparently at times. I would argue it's better than making the alternative a habit. We value clear, concise and honest communication at all times, both between ourselves and with clients. We don't shield our engineers from clients. We don't hide them behind project managers. We treat everyone like adults. We support their growth as communicators. We trust them to be representatives of our company, which is a lot easier to do when you know you all share the same values. Our craft is our passion. Now, I have the luxury of knowing my team well enough to know they're all uniquely passionate about what they do as individuals and also what we do as a company. The passion of each team member manifests in the work we deliver, the support we provide, and the way we inspire each other and push each other to grow. When this becomes a core value of a company, you're not just using it as criteria for recruitment. You're making it a commitment to your team to create and nurture an environment in which passion is valued and protected. This is vital. As I've mentioned, allowing a workplace to turn toxic, constantly setting unrealistic expectations, breaking promises. I've seen firsthand what this can do over time to even the most passionate of engineers. It's very hard to come back from. On a more positive note, the best ideas can come from anywhere. What's strange about this core value is it is actually a true measurement of the success of our other core values. Without a good vibe workplace, no one's going to want to speak up. Without being passionate about your craft, no one's going to want to share ideas. Without being straight talking, ideas may be misinterpreted and the reasoning behind them misunderstood. To support this, we have a no stupid questions approach at the Code Co. We do our best to reinforce this, especially to new hires, and try and lower the mental barriers around asking questions. We support this as leaders by making it clear that behind the scenes we're connecting with each other at all levels, constantly reaching out for support or opinions regardless of role or seniority, and putting the emphasis on the fact that we all bring something to the table. When our department is healthy and core values are followed, ideas flourish. And people aren't afraid to put themselves out there in fear of being shut down. And attention to detail. Now, valuing attention to detail might seem like a given, but defining it as a core value allows everyone to be on the same page with why it's important, especially when working at a level where one oversight could cause irreparable damage to the company, a client, or both. For attention to detail to be consistent, processes and systems need to be clearly defined. This is always an ongoing struggle for any agency, but with clear processes and effective systems, we can start to eliminate the element of human error, whether that's discovery and road mapping processes, which are crucial for accurate estimation, identifying risk early. Detailed launch processes to ensure projects launch smoothly, regardless of size or complexity. By making this a core value, we aim to provide the context around why this is so crucial to us, to the rest of the company, not use it as a way to come down when people make a mistake. Now, how do we ensure core values are being adopted? It's one thing to say them. How do we make sure people are living them? Well, first and foremost, your role as a leader is to embody these values every day in every interaction you have. Leading by example means not expecting anything from your team that you don't do yourself. Find opportunities to call out examples of core values in the actions of your co-workers. This provides positive feedback and it helps to reinforce them in people's minds along the way. Thankfully though, EOS has one more trick to keep us covered. Now the concept of right person, right seat isn't a new one. However, the way that it's implemented using EOS is uniquely effective. It begins with defining our seats or roles so that accountabilities are clear and meet the current needs of the company or the department. But where the magic really happens is how we use our core values to define who the right people for us are. This requires a company-wide acknowledgement of core values to work from top to bottom, which only further reinforces them over time. They're used when hiring. They form the basis of our quarterly conversations and our annual reviews. They're used to keep us as leaders honest to our commitment to our team, while eliminating the risk of bringing people into the company that put these values at risk or negatively impact others. Now, with the right people and the right seats, getting the right person into the right seat becomes as simple as, do they get it, can they do it, and do they want it? There's no better way to reinforce and see your shared values at work than bringing the company together, especially if you work remotely. At TCC, we hold a company retreat every 12 to 18 months, which is a chance for us to bond as a team, share experiences and showcase our achievements. Now, we often plan these around other events. For example, our retreat earlier this year involved flying the company to Manila for 8 days, although unfortunately not all of us could make it, which allowed us to also participate in WordCamp Asia together. Half the company subsequently came down with gastro. However, it was a great chance for us to spend time together as a team while learning about the culture of a country that 2 of our own employees come from, Carl, who spoke just before me, and Dreb, who's right there with the sling. Now, in addition to company retreats, we hold annual department offsites. And these allow us to focus on our craft and effectively nerd out over a period of 2 to 3 days. We use this as an opportunity to share knowledge across the department by empowering team members to showcase the use of new technologies, sharing best practices, and updating our standards. It allows us to debrief about the mistakes and challenges we've all faced as a team over the course of the previous year. Compared to retreats though, we try and keep our offsites a little more constructive and deliver outcomes back to the leadership team, which helps us justify their investment. Which leads me to my next point. So that as a leader, you're responsible for the successful outcome of these events, not just participating in them, which can be a bit of a bummer for some. So, we've made it to the end of the talk. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organisers, volunteers, sponsors, and everyone for taking time out of your weekend to make this event happen. But before I go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Now, the harsh reality of effective technical leadership, which is something I myself have only very recently come to terms with, is that at some point we have to let go of the parts of us that made us effective engineers to fully realise our potential as leaders. We have to resist our instinct to dive headfirst into every problem, to step in whenever and wherever help is needed. These reflexes we've built over years, sometimes even decades, can diminish the potential and the opportunities for the growth of those around us. This transition can be a painful one. It requires letting go of the version of ourselves that we were comfortable with, confident and familiar in. Our own growth then as leaders happens in the gap between the problem and the solution. The space we used to live in as engineers, but now must learn to hold open for others. In that space, we no longer just solve problems, we create problem solvers and future leaders. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions? I've got one. Can you give me some examples of how you actually do transparency with your staff?
All right. Well, the one example that I included in this was the fact that we don't hide anyone behind anyone else. But additional examples are we do regular state of the companies. We reveal pretty much everything. We reveal in a state of the company every major focus point that leadership is working towards over the course of a year, our revenue, our targets, our projections, where we've hit, where we've missed, a lot of it. So right from that, we're exposing a lot more than at least any of the other agencies I worked for in the past, who you would never know any of that. And the rest just comes from the way that we interact with each other. I mean, we're all very open, honest people. We speak honestly to each other. We all get along. And the core values themselves really just help keep that in a straight line. You know, the minute that someone starts rocking the boat, so to speak, and we have dishonest communication, or we find out that there are issues happening that are being hidden, which I've literally never seen happen while I've been at the Code Co, alarm bells will go off and we'll do something to correct it.
So, as a teacher and a leader, team leader, I always ask myself what I would do, how do I pass the knowledge of actually shortening that time of learning, or at least providing some sort of a pathway for newcomers to do that. So the question is, what do you do these days to make sure that the next generation will get to that point either faster or with the same amount of experience, but with less kind of bumpy road? I understand the failures are important, but do you have any specific advice on how to bring up the next generation, getting to your level either faster or...
We're not happy with palming that entire thing off to AI just yet? No? Look, it really starts from, at least at the Code Company's perspective, it starts from when you come into the Code Company, right? We have a fairly well thought out onboarding process that pairs you up with both, briefly, myself, our head of engineering, Zach, and then into a buddy system where you work alongside, and who that person is might depend on, you know, what project the new person's being brought into, or what role they're being brought into. But they're sort of paired up with someone who's going to take them through our internal documentation, the way that we've sort of, you know, we have things like a project baseline checkup list, which is something that I've been actively working on for a while now, which if you were to start on that as someone who was fairly new and work your way from the bottom all the way to the end of it, it'd take you a while, you'd come out the other side automatically knowing most of the things we've been picking up quite slowly over a matter of years. So those kind of things are built into multiple aspects of what we do, but they're reinforced from day one. And of course, things like creating our own plugins, packages, internal things that we use, things like WPMVC, which our head of engineering launched, I think, at WordCamp Sydney last year, just makes it super easy for someone to jump straight into WordPress and start operating more in an MVC approach or a more enterprisey approach without having to sort of pick up things from scratch or going down the wrong direction. So there's a billion things, basically, is my generic answer.
Cool. But it's basically pair coding, good documentation, and...
Yeah, I mean, like, everyone is paired up with someone, right? So we have lead engineers. Each of those have a direct report, and they sync every week. But it's not just every week, so you can reach out whenever you'd like. So there's no one's ever brought into the Code Company just left to their own devices. It just doesn't happen.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
One, do you, in your environment, have what we might think of as a traditional HR function?
Yeah. Partially me. We did have an actual HR person at some point in the past, but the problem with an agency of 25 is that it's right on the cusp of, you know, warranting paying a full-time HR person. So what ends up happening is a sort of a separation of concerns in HR. So I handle things like quarterly and annual reviews. I'm generally keeping a finger of the pulse of how everyone is and doing bits and pieces like that. But we then step more into operations for things like leave requests and all that sort of thing, and finance. So there's not just one person responsible for it, at least at our current size. Yeah, those responsibilities are sort of distributed.
It's just the way you were talking sounds like what we might think, oh, HR! It was like a much lighter touch within the framework that you've got.
It's a value system.
Yeah, which I thoroughly applaud.
Which we don't need any one person with a hammer standing there telling people to do these things. I mean, if anyone here's worked in an awful agency before, you'd probably find a hard time arguing against anything that was up there on the screen. Like, they're all for the better, like, they're great. And I think the one thing I can say is that there's not a lot that I need to ever do to try and force these values into anyone. Everyone's got. Yeah.
So the other question, which is also partly values related, partly business related, is how do you transfer to everybody an understanding of responsibility for the outcome? So is everybody in your organisation automatically going, we are delivering, we are selling, we are responsible for the bottom line?
Well, yeah, it's about transparency, right? So when we have these conversations with clients, because a lot of the learning as an engineer about why you should be deathly afraid of making this mistake because it's going to cause business problem A, B, and C. A lot of that happens in the dark and you're not really aware of it. An engineer could make a mistake, not have any idea of the knock-on effect and get yelled at by a project manager at some point. But because these conversations between the clients, ourselves, project managers, engineers happen together, right from the get-go, everybody, because I came onto the code company not as a director of technology. I actually came onto the code company first as a contractor doing the work. One of the things that I learned as a contractor there was being that involved from the get-go. I didn't need to be explained why these things, well, I didn't need to be anyway because I came from a business point of view, but I didn't need to be explained anything. Like, we were in the conversations with the clients, with the engineers. The clients were telling us why things were important. It was obvious. And because everybody is treated like an adult and given the responsibility, everyone just takes ownership. And like the core value of passion, passionate people care. And they will care about that sort of thing. And all you need to do is put them in a room when people are discussing the minutiae about why impact A is going to cause impact B and things that are specific to a client's business. You leave them in a room long enough, they'll absorb it over time.
Well, I'd like to thank you for taking us through that story arc, and when you got about halfway through, you were really at the stage of don't confuse selling with installing, and now you appear to be very much at the end of this is an outcome that's going to delight the customer from day one, and I think that's fabulous.
I'm happy you enjoyed it. It is a little a bit of apprehension, spending the first 15 minutes highlighting how shit you were in your early career. But it was a long time ago, I swear. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool? All good?
Again, thank you for sharing your journey. It's that reality that helps a lot of us realise our own backlog. Interesting experiences to bring us to where we are. The Coco has grown professional frustrations. When you joined, you've obviously had a lot of historical hurdles to overcome, but I would imagine you didn't have one, and your team has grown during the period. So I'm interested to know if there's one particular lever you have discovered with the team as it's grown that you could share as
EOS. That's the lever. Now, I did not turn this into an EOS presentation, and to be quite candid, I was probably one of the least... I thought I had my reservations about it in the beginning. Anything that uses that many R and TM symbols against words sends off red... But I can tell you right now, I couldn't live without it. One thing I would say to go home is Google a level 10 format meeting. These things are free. You can just go to EOS, I think it's EOS Worldwide or EOS Global, and you can download those formats and just start using them. At the start of this, but right at the start, one of the stats was in regards to inefficient meetings. I mean, that straight out of the box, like laser focuses you down. Every week, it's the same amount of time, it's the same agenda. You can rotate who's doing presenting so you all get experience, and then you can go off and lead your own L10 format meetings in your own departments. And it focuses on IDS, which is identify, discuss and solve, because one of my pet peeves from meetings for my entire career is that you would go into a meeting, talk in circles for 45 minutes and leave it not wondering what you were supposed to do next. Was that problem actually solved? Am I going to hear about this tomorrow? Like, you just don't know. So if there's one thing I would say to do that's a low bar of entry, it's look into EOS and just see if that can bring a bit of structure to your business, because it just frees you up to focus on the things that will allow you to grow and gets it all out of your head.
We can have a couple more questions. Oh, two. Great.
What are some of the practical activities that are happening on a regular basis within the tech team that you think are really crucial, and how it operates on that?
That's a good one. Every day? Oh no, I was asking you, you're asking me what we do every day to... Okay, cool. Well, like you mentioned, we do have one-on-one check-ins between direct reports and their engineering leads. We also have daily stand-ups. We have ad hoc sort of get-togethers and catch-up. We have a whole slew of genre or purpose-specific Slack channels that we all discuss about topics to each other during the day. We have, as I mentioned, we have the engineering offsites that we sort of start planning for in advance, which is, it is difficult as an agency when you have to deal with the reality of billable time, to be able to set aside regular large chunks of time to pull an engineering team of 15 people into. So the engineering offsite really solves that problem by allowing us to have, we have enough regular touch points to keep circles connected, which is another EOS term. But then at the end of the year, we have 3 solid days where we can basically get together, talk about new tech, we can review standards, we can make sure that we're on the bleeding edge of things where we can, but also talk about our failures and things that didn't work. For example, I believe it was the last engineering offsite we had, I think I spoke for about an hour about some of the issues we ran into on a massive project that we've just learnt, just as a way to feed that information back to everyone else and make everybody else aware of what was happening. So we are limited, like we can't say, oh, we're going to, 15 people are going to have an hour meeting on a Wednesday every week, or what, because that's 15 hours of billable time, and reality is reality. But we also don't work in isolation either.
Last question?
Have you ever fired anybody for not meeting your values?
I wouldn't say we fired anyone for directly not meeting one value, because the knee-jerk reaction to someone not meeting a value is not to fire them. So every time we do a quarterly, we do what's called like a core value checkup. And at that point, you go through the core values with the person, and they're either meeting that core value, they're either sometimes doing it, or they're not, at which point you start working on it with someone. And to my knowledge, this far, there's no one that's needed to work on a core value as part of us detecting that sort of during a quarterly, which also comes from 360 sort of feedback from other agencies and whatnot. We have an open, honest conversation with them about what this means and why it's going to be an issue. And then someone like me will actively work with the person over the course of the next quarter to bring that back up. And I've never been in a situation where we've had to work on a core value with someone and it's gone downhill and we've needed to fire them. Touch wood.